I froze when I opened my calendar that morning. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen in absolute shock. There it was, clear as day, impossible to ignore. Performance review, 2 p.m. Same day. My wedding day. My manager, Ryan Kessler, had scheduled my performance review on the most important day of my life. The most significant moment I'd been planning for 2 years. I couldn't believe what I was seeing. I read it again, then again, hoping I'd somehow misunderstood the calendar notification. But no. It was definitely there. Scheduled into my calendar, confirmed and locked in. My heart pounded against my ribs like a drum being beaten by an angry hand. Every ounce of shock, disbelief, and pure fury hit me at once like a physical force. I forced a shaky smile and took a deep breath that caught in my throat. I told myself this wasn't over. He did this on purpose. There was absolutely no way this was an accident. Ryan always knew exactly how to hurt people in ways that looked innocent on the surface. But this time he'd made a critical mistake. He'd crossed a line he couldn't uncross. He'd shown me exactly what kind of person he was. And I would remember that lesson forever. I moved through my wedding day like a ghost haunting my own celebration. I smiled at guests with practiced perfection, shook hands, hugged relatives, pretended joy while my insides burned with anger that I could barely contain. My beautiful white dress, which I'd spent months finding, felt like a costume, a disguise hiding my rage. Every moment that should have been perfect was poisoned by what Ryan had done, by his deliberate cruelty. During dinner, I kept checking my phone obsessively, watching the clock creep toward that scheduled review time with dread. The audacity of it made my blood boil so intensely I thought I might scream. I danced with my new husband, but my mind was somewhere else entirely, spinning with resentment and plans. Ryan's manipulation, his obvious favoritism toward certain employees, his constant taking credit for my work, it all flashed through my mind like a highlight reel of betrayal and humiliation. I realized then that anger alone wouldn't win this battle. Anger was temporary and self-destructive. I needed something stronger, something smarter. I needed a plan. I needed strategy and patience and raw intelligence. I would make him regret this. I promised myself silently. I would do it elegantly, so perfectly that he'd never see it coming. This wasn't about revenge. This was about justice. That night, after the wedding ended and I was alone with my racing thoughts, unable to sleep despite exhaustion, I looked back over the years. I thought about the projects I'd poured myself into, sacrificing weekends and evenings, the opportunities Ryan had stolen from me with his manipulations, the humiliations I'd swallowed silently to keep my job and pay my bills. One particular client pitch still stung like a fresh wound even now, a massive account worth millions that took me 3 months to land. 3 months of research, networking, and careful planning. Ryan had walked into a final meeting and claimed it as his own work. His vision, his relationship with the client. My name wasn't even mentioned in the closing. The client believed him because he was the manager, the authority figure, the person with a title. That moment crystallized something fundamental in me. Ryan underestimated me completely. He thought I was just another employee he could step on without consequences. But I had the skills. I had the patience and discipline to work quietly. I had the intelligence and analytical mind to take him down completely. I just needed to be smart about it. Precise, patient, absolutely ruthless, and willing to wait however long it took. I started watching Ryan closely after that night, like a detective building a case against a criminal. Every meeting, every interaction, every smug little smirk he gave when someone else made a mistake or when he stole credit for their work. I logged it all in my mind with perfect detail, like a camera recording everything. I began quietly documenting everything that mattered, saving emails to encrypted folders, organizing project notes with dates and times, collecting evidence of missed deadlines and opportunities he'd buried. My hands shook the first few times I saved files that could hurt him, files that contained the truth about his incompetence, but I told myself this wasn't paranoia or obsession. This was preparation. This was survival. This was building a foundation that couldn't be destroyed. One day, while organizing old project files that I shouldn't have even had access to, I stumbled on something that made my breath catch in my throat. A critical mistake Ryan had made 2 years ago, something massive, something he'd carefully buried and hidden from leadership. Something that could completely ruin him if the right person found out about it. Something that violated company policy in significant ways. I saved that file immediately and backed it up 3 times. A high-stakes project landed on my desk 3 weeks later. Exactly the kind of project I knew Ryan would try to hijack for himself. I knew before it even arrived that he would try to claim credit for it and push me to the background. He always did with the important ones, the big money projects, the ones that impressed executives. I poured myself into that project with everything I had, working late nights until my eyes burned, perfecting every detail, ensuring everything was flawless and brilliant. This time, unlike before, I kept meticulous records of everything. Every email, every decision, every piece of work bore my name and timestamp. When the client saw the finished product, they absolutely raved about it. The feedback was glowing and specific, praising my vision and execution. I knew Ryan would try to claim credit, as he always did without fail. But this time I had proof. Documentation. Evidence that couldn't be questioned. The thrill of that small, controlled victory coursed through me like electricity flowing through my veins. The client sent me a direct thank you email, bypassing Ryan entirely, which meant he would never see it. They specifically mentioned my name and my vision for the entire project. That email went into my archive. I started noticing whispers among my colleagues over the following weeks. Other team members began confiding in me, speaking quietly when Ryan wasn't around, acknowledging the favoritism they'd witnessed, the mistakes they'd watched Ryan make and somehow get away with despite the consequences. One ally, a sharp woman named Victoria who worked in accounting and understood numbers and patterns, slipped me a tip about an internal audit that Ryan had tried to hide from leadership. She whispered it to me in the break room, looking around carefully to make sure no one was listening. My network was growing steadily. My evidence was stacking up like building blocks. And Ryan's arrogance was blinding him completely to all of it. He had no idea that people were beginning to doubt him seriously. No idea that questions were being asked behind closed doors in executive offices. He strutted around the office like he owned it, completely unaware that the ground beneath him was cracking with fault lines. With one wrong move, one misstep, he could collapse entirely. And I would be ready. I would be waiting. I began building my archive carefully and methodically, like a scientist conducting an experiment. Digital files on an encrypted drive that I kept at home, secured with passwords only I knew. Physical documents locked in a safe deposit box at a bank across town. Screenshots of conversations, email threads saved with headers intact, project timelines with dates and names, performance metrics that told a clear story. Every piece of proof of Ryan's incompetence and favoritism was carefully catalogued and organized into folders with logical naming systems. I created a spreadsheet with columns for dates, incidents, corresponding evidence, and witness names. My pulse raced every time I saved something that could end his career, every time I added another piece to this puzzle. I told myself I wasn't doing anything illegal or unethical. I was just collecting information that was already available to me as his employee. Information that I had legitimate access to as part of my job. Information that painted a very clear picture of his management style. A picture that showed favoritism, dishonesty, and incompetence. The more I collected, the more I realized how deep his corruption went. He'd been doing this for years. He'd built a system of theft and deception that worked because people were afraid. Ryan announced a new high-profile client presentation in late October with obvious excitement that barely masked his ambition. It was a massive account, worth millions in revenue, the kind of project that could define a career. He declared in a team meeting that he would personally lead the entire preparation and handle the full presentation himself, shutting out anyone else from the spotlight. I immediately volunteered to help with the groundwork and research. Ryan accepted with a smug smile, clearly thinking I'd just be doing grunt work, the boring background research that he could later dismiss. But I had a completely different plan in mind. I led the preparation secretly and methodically, ensuring that every single milestone was documented under my name with timestamps. Every email I sent about the project came with a clear subject line using my name. Every decision was attributed to my research and analysis. Every creative idea was documented and logged with the date and time I'd proposed it. Ryan bragged publicly about the upcoming presentation, telling board members and executives that it would cement his reputation. He had no idea the evidence trail already painted him as a fraud. He was walking straight into the trap I'd set for him so carefully. At the company retreat in September, held at a resort 2 hours outside the city, Ryan strutted around like a king holding court. He boasted about projects I had completed from start to finish, taking full credit in front of senior leadership who listened with interest. I smiled politely, nodding along, looking supportive and collegial, masking the storm that was building inside me like a hurricane gathering strength over warm water. Nobody suspected a thing. Nobody could see the anger I was containing. My plan was moving perfectly, quietly, completely unnoticed by anyone. I was building something invisible but undeniable, something that would eventually become impossible to ignore. One misstep on his part would accelerate everything I'd planned. One wrong word could trigger the avalanche. I watched him carefully, noting every exaggeration, every lie, every moment his arrogance showed through his mask of professionalism. I was becoming an expert on Ryan Kessler. I knew his patterns like I'd memorized a script. I knew his weaknesses and his vulnerabilities. And I was using that knowledge strategically to build the most elegant destruction of a career I could possibly manage. In October, Ryan tried to intimidate me during a board meeting about upcoming initiatives. He subtly mocked my wedding in front of executives, calling it a convenient excuse to miss important work commitments, and suggesting that I wasn't serious about my career or my future at the company. The room fell into uncomfortable silence. People exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with his tone and his approach. I remained calm despite my racing pulse, jotting notes with careful detail, recording every misstep in my mental archive and in the physical notebook I kept hidden in my desk drawer. Later, I realized that the executive director had noticed his comment and his hostile tone more than I'd expected. I saw her frown slightly and set down her pen with deliberate precision, and I watched her exchange a meaningful look with another board member across the table. A small seed of doubt had been planted in her mind about Ryan's character and his behavior patterns. That seed would grow with careful watering and attention over time. I knew it would because I was going to feed it carefully with evidence and documentation and perfectly timed revelations that couldn't be ignored. Ryan thought he'd won that exchange. He felt satisfied with his cutting remark and the nervous laughter it had generated from some people. He had no idea he'd just handed me another piece of the puzzle. He'd shown the board his true nature, his disrespect toward people, his underlying cruelty and unprofessionalism that he usually hid better. Over the following weeks leading into November, team members began to share stories with me during quiet break-room conversations and private meetings in corners where Ryan couldn't overhear. They talked about Ryan's obvious favoritism toward certain employees while he completely ignored others who deserved recognition. They described mistakes he'd made and then carefully covered up without any consequence to himself, shifting blame elsewhere. They spoke about opportunities he'd stolen from people who'd actually done the real work and deserved the credit. They talked about promises he'd made and then broken, about projects he'd abandoned when they became difficult. They spoke anonymously at first, worried about retaliation and damage to their careers, then with more confidence as they realized I wasn't going to judge them or dismiss their experiences. I encouraged them quietly and gently, listening carefully without interrupting, taking detailed mental notes of everything they said and when they said it. Multiple people were saying the exact same things about Ryan using different words. Multiple independent witnesses with no connection to each other. Multiple different incidents spanning years of his management. His pattern of behavior was becoming impossible to deny or excuse or rationalize away. I wasn't forcing anyone to come forward or pressuring them in subtle ways. They were doing it naturally and willingly because they were tired of being mistreated and disrespected constantly. Because they saw someone, me, who was finally standing up to him without fear. A major client emailed me directly in early November, completely bypassing Ryan as her point of contact, praising my work on their account in specific detail that made my heart race. They went into explicit descriptions about my contributions, my innovative vision, my clear leadership on the project from beginning to end. They mentioned specific solutions I'd proposed that had saved them significant money and time. They talked about how I'd understood their business better than any consultant they'd worked with before. Ryan's smug claims of leadership were contradicted in black and white text that left no room for interpretation or argument. I forwarded the email to my personal account immediately, adding it to my comprehensive archive with detailed notes. Ryan erupted in an aggressive email to me later that day, questioning why the client had contacted me directly instead of going through him as my manager. His tone was hostile, condescending, and threatening in subtle ways that made it clear he felt his authority had been challenged. He demanded to know exactly what I'd said to them and what I'd promised them regarding future projects. I responded professionally and calmly, keeping my emotions completely out of my response, using neutral language and facts, leaving a perfect record of his emotional instability and his unprofessionalism on display. That email would later incriminate him further in the eyes of leadership and the board. He'd created evidence of his own behavior and his true character without even realizing what he was doing. I took a strategic pause in mid-November, pulling back deliberately and letting Ryan's ego overreach without any input from me to guide or control him. Each boast he made without thinking, each aggressive move he took to assert dominance, each claim of credit for my work that he made without thinking through consequences, all built the perfect picture of his arrogance and his character flaws. He was painting himself into a corner slowly and systematically, and I was just letting him do it naturally without interference or manipulation from me. I didn't need to do anything dramatic or obvious that would raise suspicion. His own nature was his downfall. His inability to control his ego was his fundamental weakness. His need to dominate and take credit was his fatal flaw. The internal audit was looming just ahead in December like a storm on the horizon. I knew it was scheduled for early in the month. I knew exactly what it would find because I'd seen the preliminary reports that Victoria had shared with me confidentially during a private lunch. I knew exactly how to position myself when the results came in and became public knowledge. In late November, I began sending gentle reminders to leadership about project progress and milestones we'd achieved without fanfare. Subtle communications that highlighted what we'd accomplished as a team while emphasizing my specific contributions. Thoughtful emails about areas where I'd contributed significantly and taken initiative that others had overlooked. Always phrased as helpful suggestions and collaborative observations, never as accusations or complaints about Ryan's management. I highlighted project successes while letting the data speak for itself without editorial commentary or dramatic language. I made sure my name appeared in critical communications and documents that circulated through the company. I copied the right people on emails and kept detailed records of who received what information and when. I was building a public record that directly contradicted everything Ryan had been saying about his own contributions and his role in our success. Ryan unknowingly signed off on a critical mistake that was now fully documented with his name and signature attached permanently. He'd approved something that violated company policy in obvious and significant ways. He'd approved it without reading the details carefully because he trusted his own judgment too much and didn't believe anyone would question his decisions. And I had proof in writing that would be admissible as evidence. The first major twist came in early December, just before the holidays when people were distracted and thinking about their time off. Ryan tried to blame a colleague named Marcus for a project failure that he himself had caused through poor management and lack of oversight. He called Marcus into his office late on a Friday afternoon and reprimanded him publicly in front of other team members, humiliating him in a way that was unprofessional and cruel. Marcus's face turned red as Ryan described his supposed failures. But I had records, detailed documentation showing that Ryan had made the critical decision that led to the failure. Marcus hadn't even been involved in that part of the project. My records exposed Ryan completely and absolutely without any room for doubt or interpretation. Marcus filed a formal complaint with HR after the incident, feeling validated because I'd offered to help him compile evidence. HR began investigating quietly but thoroughly. They reviewed the documentation I'd helped Marcus compile and organize chronologically. Ryan's confidence faltered slightly in front of senior management during meetings. I could see it in his face and his body language. The certainty was cracking like thin ice in spring. Something was happening that he couldn't control or manipulate away successfully. Fear was creeping in around the edges of his arrogance. I timed the submission of key reports to coincide perfectly with Ryan's most public moments of pride and bragging about achievements. When he was boasting about accomplishments in meetings with executives present, I made sure the board had documentation showing my actual contributions and leadership. When he claimed credit in front of senior leadership and board members, I ensured that emails contradicting his statements were already in circulation among the people who mattered most. The contrast between his claims and the evidence was impossible to miss for anyone paying careful attention. The board would soon have undeniable evidence of his incompetence and his dishonesty. Senior leadership was starting to ask pointed questions about his claims. I could feel the shift happening in the office culture and the way people treated him. People were beginning to doubt him seriously. Conversations would stop when he entered a room. People would exchange looks. His authority was visibly deteriorating in real time. The internal audit results came in on December 10th, exactly on schedule and exactly as I'd anticipated and planned for months. They confirmed significant discrepancies in Ryan's projects and accounts, and the trail led directly and obviously to him without any possibility of misdirection. Financial irregularities that couldn't be explained away, documentation failures that violated protocol, misrepresented timelines and deliverables that had caused real problems. Everything I'd been documenting personally became official company business with the weight and authority of an independent audit behind it. The audit team had found the same problems I'd discovered months earlier during my own research. They'd reached the same conclusions I'd reached through careful analysis and documentation. Ryan tried to cover it up when he first learned about the results. He called the audit lead directly and requested an urgent meeting to discuss interpretation and clarify findings. But it was too late. The process had already started. The damage was already documented in an official report that had been filed with the board and multiple executives. A trusted ally seemed to betray me in mid-December, testing my resolve and my confidence in my carefully laid plan. Victoria, the woman from accounting who'd tipped me off about the audit months ago, suddenly started defending Ryan in a team meeting about the audit findings. My heart sank completely into my stomach. I thought I'd been betrayed by my one real supporter inside the company. I thought my plan had fallen apart completely after all this time. But it was actually a red herring. I'd planned for this possibility weeks earlier when Victoria and I had discussed strategy over coffee away from the office. Victoria was actually gathering more evidence from Ryan's financial records and his approval patterns. She was testing how he'd respond if she appeared supportive of him. Ryan had relaxed around her, thinking he had at least one person in his corner who believed in him. He started revealing information to her that he wouldn't say to anyone else. Information about offshore accounts, about payments, about deals. Information that would strengthen my case even more. Public humiliation loomed as we approached Ryan's birthday on December 27th, the date he'd always celebrated at work with a party. He'd planned a major presentation to the board, meant to cement his control and reputation and prove that the audit findings were mistakes or misinterpretations by the auditors. I watched calmly from a distance, knowing my documented evidence would overshadow everything he said and destroy his arguments completely. The stage was perfectly set for his fall from grace. The audience was primed with doubt about his honesty and his competence. The evidence was overwhelming and meticulously organized with tabs and cross-references. When he stood up to present, he would have no idea what was coming. The board members had already reviewed the audit findings thoroughly and completely. They already knew about the complaints from Marcus and other employees. They were waiting to hear his explanation and his response. And his explanation would fail spectacularly and publicly. My confidence was rising noticeably as I mentored overlooked colleagues who had suffered under Ryan's management for years. The team that had been demoralized and beaten down began to flourish under my quiet leadership and genuine support. Morale improved visibly day by day as people felt heard and valued. People started speaking up in meetings with ideas and suggestions without fear. They felt safe because I was listening carefully and supporting their initiatives. Ryan watched this transformation happen with growing frustration and concern. He could sense that he was losing control of the department, but he couldn't figure out how or why it was happening. His attempts to reassert authority only made things worse and revealed his insecurity to everyone. People were less afraid of him now. They'd realized that his power was fading like a setting sun. His reputation was collapsing around him as more people discovered the truth. Ryan's arrogance peaked 3 days before his birthday when he couldn't contain himself anymore despite warning signs. He boasted in a large team meeting about accomplishments that never happened the way he described them. He exaggerated his role in projects beyond recognition. He claimed credit for innovations he hadn't contributed to. He was blind to the fact that I had all the proof lined up and ready to be released to the board. He spoke with such confidence, such certainty, such absolute arrogance and swagger. He had no idea this was his final moment of false confidence and bravado. One final email was about to seal his fate completely and permanently. I'd sent it that morning to the board director, a comprehensive summary of all documented evidence, organized clearly with tabs and sections, with dates and specific details that couldn't be disputed. She'd read it carefully and thoroughly. She was ready for his presentation. She was waiting to expose him. I orchestrated Ryan's birthday as the setting for his ultimate exposure and professional destruction forever. The board had scheduled an emergency meeting for that morning before the office celebrated with cake and decorations. Key players were positioned and ready for their roles. Evidence was timed perfectly for maximum impact. Every witness was prepared and ready to testify. Everything was in place like chess pieces on a board. Ryan came to work that day expecting to be celebrated by his team and given gifts. Some colleagues had even gotten him a birthday cake and a card as a tradition of the office. He had no idea that his entire world was about to collapse around him completely. The irony was beautiful and perfect and poetic. On the day meant to celebrate him on his special birthday, he would face his complete professional destruction. It was poetic justice. The strategic strike came at 10 a.m. sharp on his birthday morning as planned. The board director called Ryan into the boardroom with no explanation or warning. I wasn't there physically watching it happen, but I heard what happened from multiple sources later that day. She presented irrefutable evidence of his incompetence and manipulation systematically. Documents, emails, audit results, witness statements, all organized chronologically. His smug smile vanished completely as he realized the scope of what she was showing him. The room was absolutely silent except for her voice, laying out case after case of his failures and dishonesty. Ryan tried to defend himself desperately and frantically, but every excuse was countered with documentation and evidence. He had no answers for her questions. He had nowhere to hide. He looked physically ill as his world collapsed. The fall was total and immediate and devastating for him professionally. By noon that day, Ryan had been placed on administrative leave pending termination for cause. Colleagues who'd been afraid of him suddenly felt free to speak openly about their experiences without fear. Clients who'd worked with him began requesting to work with me directly instead. His reputation crumbled into dust in just hours. The arrogance that had protected him, that had made him feel invincible, had built the trap that now held him completely prisoner. He'd done most of the damage himself through his own behavior and choices. I just documented it carefully and presented it clearly to leadership without embellishment. HR processed his termination the following week after conducting their own investigation. He left the company with nothing and a damaged reputation in the entire industry. Nobody would hire him. I stepped into a leadership role by January and was promoted to manager with responsibility for the entire department and its future direction. My colleagues respected me now, not just for the quality of work I did, but for the integrity I'd shown throughout the entire situation. I'd never compromised my character or my values for personal gain. I'd never lied or manipulated dishonestly like Ryan had done. I just documented the truth carefully and let it speak for itself powerfully and clearly. Ryan never contacted me again after that day. He disappeared from our industry fairly quickly. I learned something profound through this entire experience. Patience, intelligence, and strategy always win in the end. Revenge didn't need chaos or violence or vindictiveness. It needed precision and documentation and timing. And I delivered it flawlessly. More importantly, I'd learned that standing up for myself and my colleagues wasn't selfish. It was necessary. It was right. It was the only ethical choice. And it had changed everything for everyone.